Today we are going to talk about successful team communication, and it's the third in our series. Our objective today is this workshop will help you facilitate interdisciplinary conversations to establish a shared team understanding of processes and systems. So we're going to learn how to talk to your team members and how to communicate effectively. I want to take a minute to give a shout out to the Interactions Core at CAIRIBU. So Christina Peniston, Jennifer Alvarez, and Mariana Coughlin have all been super helpful. As you know, I believe I've seen all of you before. I couldn't do this without them, so I want to give them kudos and say thank you. Introduce myself a little. I think this is our third, fourth, or fifth session for some of us. So I'm Whitney Sweeney. I am a scientist with the ICTR Team Science Core, sharing my knowledge of teams and how they work together broadly, especially with consortia like CAIRIBU. I've worked closely with our director, Betsy Rowland, and also our program manager, Patrick Kelly. So just making sure that all of my team members, near and far, are acknowledged. So you should be generally familiar with the ground rules. Microphones off. If you can have your cameras on, that would be awesome. But I do know sometimes that's not always possible, either due to bandwidth or you need to take a break for a minute, get that package that came to the door briefly. Asking that you stay focused and avoid, email and other distractions if possible. I've seen all of you in all of our sessions, so I don't have to worry about anybody dominating. And you all seem to come with an open mind. I like to always ask that you honor confidentiality. So whatever lessons you learn here, please share those far and wide. But if somebody tells a specific story, keep that story private and confidential. And then make sure you critique ideas and not people. So let's just take a second and remind ourselves of where we've been so far. So the very first session was on forming successful teams, doing that strategically. So clarifying and articulating your mission and your goals, determining what your team needs, identifying who you think good collaborators are, and strategically and mindfully recruiting for them. And then getting to know all of your current and potential collaborators. I've been using that metaphor below the surface so that you know whether or not you can work together. It's important that we create the right environment for our team so that we can have the kind of communication we'll be talking about. So we want to make sure people feel included, that they have the opportunity to try things out and learn and make mistakes, that they can bring their whole self to the session and contribute, and that they can challenge both for innovation and to prevent potential problems. So putting all of this in context, so after completing this workshop, hopefully you will be better able to facilitate discussions to span disciplinary boundaries and develop a shared understanding for an interdisciplinary research collaboration. To develop processes for the coordination of an interdisciplinary research collaboration, and to provide effective feedback. We're coming back to that idea of giving good feedback and communicating well with your team members. This will help resolve conflicts, hopefully prevent them, but help resolve the conflicts on your teams. So let's go ahead and start talking about getting that shared understanding. And what we're going to talk about is creating what we call, so this is my jargon, and we're going to talk about jargon in just a minute, but trained as a social scientist, that my jargon is we're going to ask that your team collectively create a shared mental model. So who the team is, what they're doing, and how it all fits together is that shared idea that you sort of co-produce. It's sometimes people talk about the co-production of knowledge. So the definition, so to explain my jargon, the definition is a shared understanding among team members relating to essential aspects of a team environment. So it's really important that teams work to have these shared understandings. It helps to reduce uncertainty, to prevent or lower the potential for misunderstandings, to prevent conflict, to improve coordination and adaptation, and to increase the effective team functioning. So if your team has a shared idea of how things are supposed to move forward, they will do so more effectively. And then here's just a quote from a paper a seminal paper that teams that perform well hold shared mental models. So how do you do this? We're going to start small. Sometimes all you need to do is explain your jargon. So just like I explained what a shared mental model is, when you have people on your interdisciplinary teams, usually people know when they don't know something. So I'm hearing this pops up for you, that this is relevant, and that you're aware of it, and that your teams, or at least you, are comfortable asking those questions, because there are some teams where people are not as comfortable. And so the team needs to set up a procedure. For example, they might have, I don't know, some people have like quick terms. They might say red light, red light. And that means that they don't understand something, or they, have a paddle that indicates that they don't, or they raise their hand. But it sounds like you all have procedures in place so that you can have those conversations. And that's terrific, because at the end of the day, you don't want to go forward if somebody doesn't know what you're talking about. That's not going to be effective. And Stephen, I love that you brought up, having common terms be problematic, because sometimes that's the most difficult. You'll be having a conversation and you won't realize that you're not talking about the same thing. Whether, common terms that I've encountered are models. What's a model for your team? What does that really mean? Even here in the science of team science, we debate what is team science? What's in scope? What's out of scope? And sometimes small practical things. An example I often give is the draft. I used to be on a team, admittedly not a research team, an administrative team, but I used to be on a team where I worked with somebody who really liked to do all the final editing himself. And so we had developed a great working relationship where I basically combined in a really quick draft all the information that was needed. And it wasn't the most beautiful thing, but it was quick and I got it to him. And then he would finesse it. And then later I went to another team and they said, I need a draft of something. And I did exactly the same thing. And they said, no, that's not what I wanted. What they wanted was the pretty polished version. So even some of those very common terms can be problematic. And sometimes if they're wide in scope, so we just had a quick conversation about this. I feel like we have a general understanding of what each of us thinks of in terms of research impact. Okay, maybe you don't know exactly what I think about research impact, but at least if you were team members, you would have a better understanding. So I would argue that you need to make space on your teams to have these kinds of conversations. And if you happen to notice that you think you might not have the same idea, then it's definitely worthwhile having that conversation. I know that I've been on teams, that draft situation, I said, oops, I think we don't have the same notion of draft. I've had conversations with people as like, okay, hold on a second. I don't think we're actually talking about the same thing when we say team science. So at least for our purposes, what's in and out of scope. So having the time to talk about it, and then potentially document that for your team in some kind of charter or some kind of, even in just a simple Google Doc to get you started, is a great way to keep everybody together on the same page. So some other things you might want to talk about on your teams, in addition to broad ideas like research impact, are having a shared idea of what you're going to be doing with your equipment or other people's equipment. And that seems pretty straightforward, but you'd be surprised at how many people don't talk about that and then come up with, conflicts or conflicts over using the equipment. Talking about how you're going to do your tasks and potentially documenting that. So whatever it is, the tasks that each of your team does, having a shared idea of the best way to do that, or even documenting that there's multiple ways to do that and that those are all okay. Talking about how you communicate and how you share your documents and data. I'm pretty sure I've addressed this before, but even just being clear about, how are you going to meet, where are you going to share your documents. I worked with an industry partner on a team a while back, and we just our team at the UW made the unilateral decision. We were going to do everything in Box. And because most of them didn't have access, one happened to be alumni, so she had access through some kind of affiliate account, but nobody else could get into the Box folders, at least as they were configured. So we had to pivot and share things in Google Drive. So just having those conversations, we could have saved ourselves a couple of weeks of like, I can't get into the documents, had we had that conversation up front. Knowing who's on your team, this goes back to that first session, strategically selecting team members, knowing who's on your team, knowing who knows what and what they're contributing. And then, of course, timelines, making sure that everybody's clear about whether or not the work is urgent and important, and then how you are going to approach those deadlines. So these are just some other things to think about when you're creating those shared ideas. So having these discussions could be as simple as the conversation we had today. So you could do, if you need to generate additional ideas, you could do a basic brainstorming session. So you will get all of these slides. They'll be available on the website shortly after this session. And these all have links. So this link here is to some, it's a Miro board article about good ways to brainstorm. Sometimes you need to do something unusual or to really get a conversation going. I don't know if are any of you familiar with liberating structures? No? Okay. Well, there's a link here to their website. So the Liberating Structures, it was created by Lipanovitz and McCandless, and they have a number of different kinds of facilitation techniques that can help you have conversations for just about any kind of situation. So if you ever need to have an outside of the box kind of conversation, I recommend you check them out, or even just for fun. They just have some really interesting ideas. The book, I believe you have to pay for. You have to buy the book, but all of their activities that are on their website are all free. So you can try them all out. I also recommend that everybody hone their skills in facilitation. Now, obviously, you guys are all super busy, so maybe you can't attend 50 million workshops or community of practice, but even if you send a team member or two to something like I attend the Focus on Facilitation community of practice. They meet about once a month. I think it's centered here at the UW, but we have people internationally who attend it. And we cover all kinds of topics about how to host good meetings. The topic last week was about subtle acts of exclusion. And so sometimes it has to do with DEI type of things, but I also attended a terrific session that was teaching or presenting somebody else's materials. Like, how do you approach those? So if you want to check them out, there's a link there. You can see what kinds of things they're talking about. If your team has some big picture things that they really need to dig into, you can also try a more intensive intervention that's called the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative. There is a fee, but they walk you through all kinds of, they have you complete a survey. They walk you through questions like, what does data mean to you? What is science? And you talk about these big picture questions, and then your team gets a very thorough understanding of these bigger picture ideas. So these are all here for tools for you that you can check out, or you can share with your teams and see if you want to assign or delegate that to someone else to check out. That's okay too. As we're talking about our communication techniques, we're talking about building support systems essentially for your teams. So we've touched on them a little bit, but the necessary systems that your team needs are communications, coordination and project management, and data management. And by having and ironing out and having a clear idea of these strong systems, it allows your team to focus on your research. So again, this is that strategic upfront conversation that you have so that you can focus on your research, makes your mission, vision, and goals concrete and trackable, and it helps create a culture of accountability, transparency, and openness. Now, we talked about creating psychological safety as more of a social construct, but by having some of these things ironed out and these common understandings also create that sense of safety as well. Because if you have systems that it's easy for everybody to be accountable, everybody's aware of all of the information, and information is shared openly, that also helps create the right kind of culture. And I just love this quote by James Clear. You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. So one of the ways to establish these systems, in addition to those other facilitation techniques that I very, very briefly mentioned to you, is what we do here in the Team Science Core in terms of collaboration planning. So I've mentioned it multiple times, but I wanted to take a little deeper dive today. So collaboration planning offers a 90-minute session that engages your team to think through ways that you can work together And it's a proactive way to talk through things so that you have less conflict as your team progresses. It was originally designed, the first instance was designed by people from NIH and NSF, and we have adapted it. Actually, Betsy Rowland, the director, has adapted our version here at UW. It's helpful so your teams can work better. It's helpful for creating a template for writing your multi-PI plan, if any of you have to do that, or addressing specific review criteria, or even just trying to find out what skills your team might need to build. So our collaboration planning intervention is a worksheet essentially of questions that we talk you through, asking you a question, what's your mission? What's your team mission? Who's on the team and how will they contribute? And you'll see that we have these 7 categories here. So vision, roles and responsibilities, team processes and function, team culture, team outputs, project management and infrastructure. And then ultimately, how are you going to use the document? So ideally you create this, it's like a team charter, and you create this collaboration plan. And then how are you going to use that to help your team move forward? So this in and of itself is a 90-minute intervention. So we don't have time to do it all today, but I thought that we could talk through one of the more commonly problematic things that people like to talk about, which are team outputs. And so what kinds of outputs do you anticipate arising from this project? So if we jump to the next slide, here's an actual snippet from the collaboration plan. And these are 2 simple questions, or at least they seem like they're simple questions. So the first one, what kinds of outputs do you anticipate arising from this project? So this is a pretty straightforward question. So publications, property, data sets, any other kind of scholarly output, etc. So I'm guessing your teams do all of the above, some of the above. So publications, do you have any property or intellectual property or patents? Intellectual property is pretty general, but patents for your teams? Anybody? No?
Yeah, this is all stuff that we deal with every day.
Okay, excellent. I had a feeling. So that would be easy enough. So you just list out the list if you were creating a collaboration plan. Here's the question that becomes a little more challenging is, what will your authorship or attribution policies be? It is the #1 most problematic situation on teams. It's the #1 source of conflict. And it comes from so many different things. I just threw some things up here too. There's the issues of, you put somebody on a paper just because they need it. So they have honorary. Now, maybe you don't do that, but people have been known to do that to help them get into graduate school or tenure or whatever. Then there's those people that get forgotten, and that's never fun. And then if you deal with really, really big teams. So I recently attended a talk. There's a link in the resources. I recommend it. I attended a talk by Coles. He works on a consortia for psychology experiments in Stanford, I think. And he has an article about what do you do with authorship for huge teams, these like multinational, international consortia. And then how do you deal with disputes on those teams? So an interesting thing that came up is when you have like 50 authors, do you put everybody on the page, on the paper? And then even then, imagine trying to come to a consensus with 50 people. And so they've come up with some really creative new approaches for some of those things. So one of which is sometimes they have the opportunity to document dissent. So the team might say, go ahead and publish the paper, but then the people who have dissenting opinions will simply write up something that then gets published along with the paper. So there's some interesting creative ways to handle those kinds of things. I would say, at least in a paper that I read as of 2016, at least 60% of sort of biomedical journals had some kind of authorship policy and I'm seeing a few nods that maybe some of you have seen this. This one's from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. And this is just one policy put forth by a journal. So this one is substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data, and drafting the work and revising it, and final approval of the version to be published, and then agreement to be accountable. So just, I'm hearing that you've all had some conflict around authorship. And so this is where we were going to have a conversation about your team's approach to authorship. So it sounds like none of you have formal policies. So how do you approach it? I love the idea of having that conversation early, if you can do it at the outset. So then again, it helps identify whose roles are what on the team, and then revisit that. So we all know research is not completely linear, not usually. It doesn't always go as planned. And so sometimes you have, maybe a graduate student leaves, maybe the experiment tanks, these things all happen. And then having that conversation, now what? Now, how are we going to move forward? So revisiting that regularly. So again, I do recommend, if you haven't written it down, I recommend having that conversation. It helps avoid conflict, even if, it sounds like the teams you're on right now are all very high functioning, but it's always to keep them that way and to avoid conflict. It's a good conversation to have. So let's go ahead and move on and sort of revisit. I wanted to say a few more things about feedback and sharing information in general. So I think in the last session, we talked about some general strategies in terms of feedback. And even in that conversation, it's definitely, there's an art to providing effective feedback and sharing information. And I think one of the key things is to be ready to listen and to ask questions, to come to these conversations with curiosity and openness, whether you're the giver of the feedback or the receiver of the feedback. And I like this quote by Degas. So the ballerina has nothing to do, except for I think she was created by Degas. But it's not what you see, but what you make others see. So if you are the person sharing the information, if you are the person giving the feedback, then ultimately you're successful if and only if that other person understands what you're saying and understands what needs to be done. So that's really important. It's sort of a different way of thinking, is how can you help them understand versus just telling them something. So let's think about it for a minute in terms of the giver and the receiver of information. So based on what I just said, so often people think that the giver is just giving information. It's a one-way street. But in reality, it's actually an interaction. It's reciprocal. And both people bring something to the conversation. The whole notion of communication is that it's not solo. You're communicating something to one person or more people. Often there are problems, and here are some of the common problems that occur in sharing feedback or just sharing information in general. So the giver might have problems. Maybe the way they're presenting the information isn't useful, it's too general, it's confusing. If you think about the receiver of the information, maybe they're not ready for that information. Maybe they don't have the educational background, the training. Maybe there's emotional things going on. Sometimes it's easy to understand the information, but it's difficult to understand how to change things. So thinking about if you're the giver of the information, are you giving clear strategies? So here's what you need to know, and here's what you need to do to change the behavior or the task or whatever it is you're asking them to change. You need to make sure that the receiver is able to do that. I know that I have actually been on tasks where I completely understand what it is they're telling me, but I have no idea how to make that happen. Make sure that feedback or information has an opportunity to be used. So that's especially true if you're going to be giving somebody information, whether it's an instruction or feedback, you're giving somebody information like 2 months in advance. That's probably not the best timing for that information. They're probably going to forget what you're telling them. They're not ready to apply that. Sometimes the receivers don't apply it for a variety of reasons. They don't feel like it, they don't want to. And then there's these emotional things that go along with this situation, especially if you're giving corrective feedback. So the giver might be concerned about negative reactions. There's actually a paper by Abby Esver et al. Where they found that the givers of feedback, now the experiment was actually simple feedback, like, hey, you have mustard on your shirt. but they found that they underestimated the value of that feedback. And that the people in those situations absolutely would have wanted that information, but they didn't think, when asked later, they didn't think that that other person would want them to intervene. So there is research out there that says that the givers of feedback often underestimate the impact it will have. And then, of course, always worrying about whether or not that person's going to react negatively. So just laying this out, I do this partially to think through. If you've ever been in situations where feedback went awry, if you think through these different things, you might think, okay, what went wrong here? Was I not clear? Were they not ready? Was the timing wrong? So just trying to figure that out can sometimes be helpful as you put together your message. I like this diagram. It actually came from a paper in education. This is about teacher-student interactions, but I really liked it, and I modified it to apply here. So I like the way the diagram shows the responsibility involved. And so you have the giver responsibility up here with this triangle, and then you have the receiver's responsibility. And again, what I like about this is it shows that it's the two people. This is a one-on-one conversation, but the two people and how both people have responsibilities here. And Shane, to your point, notice that number 2 here is all about the culture. It's a culture of trust. It's a culture of psychological safety. So let's jump back to the green. We'll go in order down the list. The first thing that we need in these situations is having awareness. Information is clear, it's aligned with the goals of the team, and is aligned with the team members. So that sort of touches on getting to know the team members. And notice that in terms of responsibility, that the giver has a much bigger responsibility here. So when you're sharing information, it's up to the giver of the information to be clear. And to make sure that that information is clear. But notice here that the receiver is still involved in that. It's up to them. If it's not clear, they need to ask questions. If it doesn't fit, if it doesn't seem like it's in scope, they need to ask questions. But the bulk falls onto the giver. And then here's that culture of trust and psychological safety that we talked about before, because you're absolutely right. If you give somebody feedback, if you try to share information with them and they are not ready, or that relationship isn't right, that is not going to work. And notice that in this case, it's a little bit more equal here, that both people are supposed to bring together the trustworthy parts of that relationship. And then having the opportunity to implement it, there's that timing piece. It's again a little bit more equal. Any lack of equality is just my drawing skills. So, and then in terms of the reflexivity, this is that this information is there to provide learning. And so notice at this point, the giver of the feedback is there to make sure that the other person understands it and learns from it. But this is where the receiver is really responsible for making sure they ask the questions and truly understand it. So one simple way that you can deal with some of the problems in sharing information or sharing feedback is to use what's called closed loop communication. And are any of you familiar with closed loop communication? Nods, no. Somewhat, okay, excellent. So it's pretty simple. It sounds like some of you are aware of it, which is you have the initial communication, the message that you're sending as the giver. And then whether you're in a group or in a one-on-one situation, you have the individuals reflect back on that information. So go ahead and say it out loud back to you. And then you go back and forth until the giver can confirm that that information has been received correctly. And I've heard this implemented in a number of different ways. And it definitely gets past the commonly problematic, does that all make sense? And I know I've done that in conversations too, where I'll give an instruction, or even you've probably caught me doing it in these workshops. I'm like, does that make sense? And when you're doing that, it's a habit, and I'm working on it. It's a work in progress. But when you do that, it's problematic for a couple of reasons, whether that's your catchphrase or something similar. And I found myself when I've been asked if it makes sense to me, I'll say yes. And I have absolutely said yes when it didn't make sense. And I either did that because I was worried that I would look stupid, or I was actually in a situation where I was worried I'd make the other person feel stupid because I didn't understand it. And either way, using closed loop communication can help you get around that issue. So a friend of mine, actually, she's terrific in meetings. She'll just do it by nature as the receiver of the information. She'll just say, okay, hold on a second. Let me reflect back what you just said. I want to make sure I got it right. But as the giver of communication, you can encourage that reflection back to make sure that they understood what you said to them. These techniques, and it's not just about feedback. It's about any kind of information that you're sharing. So Stephen, I think I heard you say something about sharing a conceptual idea. So even if you were to have a conversation about a big picture question or a theory in what you're working on, you can also do that closed loop kind of interaction to make sure that people are understanding and make sure that you're on the same page. You know, I think by research impact, I mean this. Is that what you mean? And just going back and forth and really listening to each other can help develop that common understanding that we were talking about earlier in the workshop today. So let's go ahead and sum up for the time being. So when you're cultivating communication, make sure you explain your jargon. Try out some different techniques for facilitating your discussions to create your shared mental models. And we didn't talk that much about transactive memory systems, but making sure you're clear on who knows what. That's what a transactive memory system is. Strategically plan your collaborations, potentially with either our collaboration planning or just your own set of questions. I would document as much as possible, whether it's a wiki or a Google Doc or whatever, however you want to do it. And then trying techniques like this closed loop communication, this reflexive interaction can be very, very helpful. We will have 2 more sessions, one on evaluating your team and one on leadership. And when these slides are there, all these references should be there for you. And then there's some additional links and things. And that is a wrap for today.